103. Back on the model DD 103, ladies and gents. Investigating the social world 1. Module DD 103. Academic integrity of arts and humanities. In the university, so ladies and gents, following university scripture, edited by Karim. Get through the study. Chapter 2. Investigating housing, social poverty and crime. Building on the work of Park and Burgess, criminologists Shaw and Mackay, 1931 to 1942. Become interested in the relationship between crime rates and different residential areas. To investigate this relationship, the researchers examined juvenile delinquency and crime rates alongside other statistical data about the social structure of populations in each zone, as measured by demographic data such as income, ethnicity, and age. Conducting analysis on data from over 20 large US cities, Shaw and Mackay found crime rates followed a uniform pattern and were highest in the transition zones. Zone 2 in Figure 2.8, adjacent to central business districts, they also found that high crime rates remained consistent in these areas over the time. Despite the fact that they had a high rate of population turnover. Given what you have read above, can you think of some reasons that a transition zone in a city might have a higher rate of reported crimes than other areas, even when the population within the transition zone is constantly changing? In the discussion, as you will read below, there could be many reasons for this, and up to the present day, there's also one theory that can provide a single or reliable set of causal determining factors for the presence and or absence of criminal activity among a given population. Remember the statement made by Westmisnter that you read earlier at the start of this section. What can be done is through light upon the combination of factors or circumstances associated with crime. Page 61, following study. I've read this book already, but this is my second time. As often the case with social research, the findings produced through Shaw and Mackay's research needed to be interpreted and accounted for. That is, the researchers needed to try and explain why the transition zone would remain a high crime area, despite a turnover of residents, to explain the prevalence of higher crime rates in these areas. Shaw and Mackay realized that the instability of the social environment resulted in a wide range of both conventional and deviant and criminal behaviours, which offered both legitimate and illegitimate means by which to earn a living or gain some form of social status. They argued that high levels of crime and delinquency were more likely to occur in that what could be characterised as socially disorganised neighbourhoods. Social disorganisation theory, briefly defined, suggests that socially organised parts of the city are characterised by a settled and stable population where people generally own their homes and where, because of this stability, people can exercise higher levels of informal social control over one another. That is, neighbours have vested interest in acting neighbourly towards one another, for example, respecting each other's property or privacy, negotiating over disagreements, and actively contributing to keeping their properties and streets well kept and safe. Socially disorganised parts of the city, by contrast, are, according to Shaw and Mackay, troubled by disorder and turbulence, and are characterised by unstable, transient populations. People in these areas were generally found to be poorer and could only access housing through the private rental market under short-term tenancies. As a result of instability of people's labour prospects and housing tenure, they were less likely to form a stable community of residents committed to keeping the peace and exercising formal social controls over one another. The Chicago School theories on urban development and the important environmental influence on human behaviour have been extremely influential to both sociological and criminological studies. However, they have also been criticised and questioned by other social science researchers and theorists. Much of the Chicago school's ecological approach was based on the assumption that the way that urban development was occurring was a natural process, but failed to consider, for example, whether the manner of which industry development was being planned and implemented could have been done differently to take account of inequalities or to create rather than curtail opportunities for certain populations to contribute to and participate in social and economic life of the city. In addition, the extent to which these theories applied to the cities outside the United States was questionable. The usefulness of Chicago school theories in the UK is explored in the next section. Bear with me 2 seconds, ladies and gents. Please subscribe. If you're on YouTube, Castbox listening, the proclamation news on both YouTube and Castbox, so please subscribe. Appreciate it. We're working every day. While I'm talking fluent English, you guys are hopefully picking it up and learning. Maybe give you new aspirations as well. Anyway, 3.2, social housing and crime in the UK. At the start of section 3, it was stated that research studies and the theories of crime developed in one country will often have to be investigated and examined to test their general liability to other social contexts. When the work of Chicago School is considered in relation to the UK context, some immediate contradictions become apparent. Remember that key finding from Shaw and McKay's work were that socially disorganised, high-crime neighbourhoods would be located in areas adjacent to the main business districts, as that they resulted in part from the instability of residential housing occupancies due to the transient populations and the short-term private rental market. Hello, Mr. Angel. How you doing, buddy? I haven't seen you for a little while. Now think of your own town or city where you live, or a town or city that you know. That is considered a high crime area. Do you think either social disorganisation theory or the idea of a transition zone can provide a useful explanation why the area might appear to be prone to the crime? What factors would you consider if you wanted to investigate a test of applicability of Chicago School theories in a town or a city in the UK or another country outside the United States? In the discussion, this sort of test is known as empirical validity. Here are some of the first questions you might ask. If the government supports social housing policies that provide stable, suitable housing for people with low incomes or limited financial or employment opportunities, what might be the effect on crime rates in these areas? In that high crime rates still persist in areas where social housing is provided, does that mean housing tenancy and the stability of residential population are not factors associated with crime? If they are not, then does that disapprove social disorganisation theory? Are there some aspects of social disorganisation theory that still work, even if some parts of the theory seem to be contradicted when applied to the UK context? Or is there another explanation for why crime and social disorganisation might persist, despite the fact that housing is provided? Explorations of linkage between crime, housing and neighbourhoods in the UK followed different research traditions from those of the Chicago School researchers. One of the main... What is it falling down? What the government commitments to a welfare approach to social and housing policy meant that in the UK, social housing was provided on quite a large scale, beginning at 1880s, according to UK criminologists. The provision of social housing and the policies by the local authorities maintain a clear deteriorated buildings had a profound effect on the distribution of crime in the UK. Baldwin, 1979. Due to the cost of the land, many social housing estates in the UK were built on a long distance away from the centres. Problems of crime in the UK cities were not necessarily always found in inner city areas, nor were they necessarily associated with neighbourhoods with a high turnover of residents. In addition, criminologists in the UK were concerned with the notion of the problem housing estate. The most comparable early study to Shaw and Mackay's work that was conducted in the UK was undertaken by Baldwin and Bottoms in Sheffield in 1976. Baldwin and Bottoms aimed to investigate how some housing estates could end up with a higher numbers of people being prosecuted for criminal activity than other estates, despite having populations with a comparable demographic. A number of different factors potentially contributed to crime. Page 64. Anyone following the module investigating social world 1, the module was DD 103. We're on investigating chapter 2, investigating housing, social policy and crime. Page 64. Housing estates. They found there are interactive relationship between public housing policies, allocation procedures and the reputation of particular estates. Further research conducted by Bottoms and Wiles, 1986, suggested that some housing estates could maintain their criminal or respectable reputation over long periods of time, despite continual changes among residents. Thus, Bottoms and Wiles argued the crime problem of particular individual estates would not be understood whilst taking account of housing allocation processes. NEPA 2007. Summarising the work of Bottoms and Wiles states, if an estate begins a respectable, remains sought after, and there is nothing to alter this sought after reputation, then it is likely to enjoy a safe reputation over an extended period of time. Some estates, however, acquire a bad reputation early on, sometimes as a result of the housing department's dumping of tenants regarded as problematic. Others undergo a tipping process when original tenants transfer to more desirable estates elsewhere, leaving the estate becomes categorised as a place for problems for families. I mean, you get them estates, don't you? I mean, I grew up in a suburban area, but we was just on the outskirts of the suburban area. You had kids breaching ASBO. That helps to the kids breaching ASBO. That helps. That should be in a metropolitan lunatic asylum without kids, and kids being put in care. But it's today's modern world, and the kids seem to go with the parents regardless of how much of a monstrosity of a human being they are. The kids go with them. But that's my theory. Would it be changed? I doubt it. Anyway, page 65. I'm a criminologist working in the 1970s. Also noted the role played by policing practices and over or under policing of some areas, as well as whether local authorities were exercising their political power in a way they singled individual families as problematic. See, for example, Armstrong and Wilson, 1973, or Byrne, 1974. Examinations of policing or allocation policies that might lead to the categorisation of some people or places as problems or as criminal have continued to proliferate in both the criminological and the social policy literature. Henry 2009. However, policy making and governmental interventions that attempt to solve problems of crime in particular areas continue to focus on so-called problem individuals or problem families, rather than on a range of other social and economic factors that have been shown to be associated with the occurrence of crime. When you're growing up, try not to let your child be associated with the juvenile disruption of the earth or the community, in fact. Right, finish that page. No, we haven't. It is evident then that investigating linkage between housing tenure and housing allocation and crime is a complex endeavour that is seemingly highly dependent on both local context and on housing markets or policies. The idea that some people or places can sometimes develop a reputation of problematic has long attracted attention from social scientists. The next section on housing, crime and criminology considers some of the ways that critical problems come to be viewed and categorised as criminal justice problems. 3.3. The criminalisation of social problems. When particular areas, estates or neighbourhoods look noticeably different from others, for example, or common areas are less well maintained, there is litter strewn around, or where houses and flats are in disrepair. They sometimes begin to carry on social stigma. The concept of stigma has been defined as an attribution of undesirability, discredit and social rejection. This can be applied to places, whole groups of people or individuals. Stigma attached to neighbourhoods and, by association, to the people who live in them, has real effects such as postcode prejudice. Depending on how deep or widespread the stigmatisation of a particular area is, such as label can hinder people's attempts to find employment or move into rented or social housing elsewhere. When the stigma is attached to people who are categorised into particular groups. Example, people with mental health problems, homeless people, etc. I mean, this will touch home. Some of you live in them sort of areas of sociological change, you know, where your parents, we get brought up, the parents can't really afford a nice private home anywhere, so you get put in these areas sometimes. So you get, you know, just keep yourself out of the way in groups. That's all I can suggest. I was taught better. Prisoners, drug users. It's become more likely that these groups will experience unequal access to housing because they'll be viewed as belonging to an undesirable population by some of their potential neighbours or by some property owners. At the same time, when people act in ways that other people find troublesome, threatening or dangerous, they may be calls for new policies or laws to control or prevent them from infringing on the rights of others. For example, as a response to the complaints of troublesome behaviour, primarily occurring in social housing areas, anti-social behaviour orders, ASBO, were brought into force in England, Scotland and Wales through the Crime and Disorder Act of 1998, NEPA 2007. The idea of antisocial behaviour and the subsequent policy decision and legal frameworks that were introduced to manage it. Provide a useful example of the way a social issue can lead to a particular policy decision that then slide it into criminal justice processes. The social issue that ASBOs were intended to deal with was so-called nuisance problems between neighbours or antisocial behaviour on housing estates or in other spaces. The problem ASBO were intended to target were generally trivial activities such as littering, public drunkenness, begging, distributing a piece or spitting, to name only a few, which were not illegal per se, as thus were not strictly a matter for criminal justice intervention. However, the ASBO authorities, without the burden of proof that is required to convict someone of criminal offence, breach of an ASBO, however, is a criminal offence and referred to the court where the person is to breach the order is charged and tried under the conventions of the criminal law. Thus, it has been argued that by Rutherford that the ASBO provides a particularly striking example of criminalisation of social policy. Significantly, the ASBO effectively made landlords and housing managers into guest agents responsible for implementing crime control policy. As a result, some criminologists have argued that the ASBO was fundamentally created as a tool to exercise greater levels of social control over the poor. Squires 2006 at the same time. However, some of the social issues that ASBO sought to address were very real concerns. When viewed from the perspectives of the fellow tenants or neighbours living near to someone who was troublesome. Activity 6. Taught science researcher investigated the question whether or not ASBOs had the desired effect of controlling troublesome activities in social housing areas. Bear in mind that when investigating any social problem, you need to decide whether your findings should be broadly generalisable or whether the question requires deep, specific and detailed exploration. That is often a trade-off, but in Activity 6, it is possible that both types of findings would partially answer the question. For example, a broad-ranging study might simply compare rates of reported nuisance activities in a range of areas and whether or not these rates change in relation to the number of ASBOs issued in them. However, remember what has been said in this section about the importance of local context when it comes to identifying issues associated with crime in particular areas. Thus, you might want to examine one or two estates in great detail to determine whether or not people living there felt safer and or whether those subject to an ASBO had experienced any negative or positive effects as a result of it. One overarching question likely to be asked by the criminologist or other social scientists exploring the efficiency of ASBOs, which would then guide their choice of methods to investigate it, would be to what extent has the policy decision to effectively criminalise nuisance behaviours solve the problem it was intended to solve. ASBOs are ones, just troublesome kids that are going to keep committing crime after crime. Absolute public nuisance. Fine litter, even graffiti, stupid stuff. While there appear to be some association between housing allocation, general social conditions and crime, there are no straightforward or casual connections for criminologists, particularly those concerned with recognising relationships between crime, social policy decisions and criminal justice practice. Established research has repeatedly demonstrated the problems of crime are the result of complex range of social, political and economic factors. Investigating problems of crime requires multiple questions and methods and prepared testing of theories in a wide range of contexts. In the conclusion, while the social policy and criminology and distinct areas of study, there are many social issues that draw out the overlap between these two social science fields, although the one rationale for the policy is to help reduce inequalities. Research demonstrates that it can sometimes produce the opposite effect or simply fail to reduce inequalities. For one down there's some people that want to get out of poverty and go to work, and there's other kids that don't want to do anything. They're just stuck in a rut. They're not trying to better themselves. They're not trying to go anywhere. So they try and keep all the rough ones. They might keep them to end up homeless or detained. Housing is a key topic for social policy as it demonstrates important trends in the distribution of resources. Housing was strong links to a number of the other policy areas to do with life chances, including health and education. Moreover, as some of the examples in this chapter illustrate, there is an increasing range of social problems where the lines between social policy and criminal justice policy are becoming blurred. For example, housing. This chapter has illustrated that the welfare-based policies, which might initially aim to address the needs that emerge in populations as a result of inequalities in wealth distribution and certain forms of economic development, sometimes end up transforming into policies aimed to control or even criminalise. Thus, a key point from this chapter is that investigating the social world through the combination of social policy and criminology requires you to call into question which can impact on social condition and, in doing so, result in different social outcomes for individuals. Chapter 3. Wow. Page 78. Page 78. 77. Page 77. Investigating the social world 1. We're on the second day of reading this book, but we're nearly halfway through it. Absolutely roaring for it, guys. Well chuffed. Yeah. We are. Roaring for this book. Introduction. Page 77. Public policy towards housing has changed over time, for example. Governments that were once big providers of housing as part of their association private sector landlords As an alternative source rented homes, governments have also promoted home ownership, held by the aspiration of many households to become owner-occupied, and their increasing scope for doing so as their income rises and the necessary mortgage loans become available. This chapter examines the causes and some of the consequences of rising owner occupation, which has been happening across a number of countries in recent decades. It pays particular attention to financial aspects of home buying and the collective result of treating housing as an asset. This chapter will explore the ways that households might gain economically from owning their homes and evidence that it is a motive for buying them. The theories and evidence that social scientists can use to test propositions on the causes of and impacts of home buying behaviour. The impact of property purchase on the equality of wealth distribution, wider economic impact of widespread house purchase, and of bank lending to enable this, including worsening affordability problems and financial sector instability. Section 1. Renting or buying a home. Which do you prefer? Examines evidence for people preferring ownership to renting. Section 2. Motives for home buying. Looks at possible social economic motives for wanting to own a home. Section 3. Is there evidence that people buy houses as an investment? Considers a source of evidence for people treating homes as an investment and not just a place to live. When people buy places by the seaside and they move abroad, they use that as a holiday home and rent it out in the summer. Section 4. Housing and distribution of wealth examines the impact of wealth distribution when more middle income households gain the opportunity to invest on housing. Section 5. Problems arising from housing investment. Looks at the role of rising house prices driven by the investment motive in making home ownership more difficult for younger households and in making financial sectors fragile and economies unstable. Page 79. Renting or buying, which do people prefer? During the 20th century, an increasing number of households became owners of the homes they lived in. Shows a change of proportion of homes that were owner-occupied between 1985 and 2004 for various groupings of countries in the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. The proportion of housing stock in owner-occupation rose everywhere, although it remained much higher in Eastern and Southern Europe and in English-speaking countries, including the United States and United Kingdom, than in the West or the North of continental Europe. The division between owner-occupiers, people who own their homes, and tenants, people who rent their homes, varies widely across regions. But as countries' national income, gross domestic product, or GDP, grows, home ownership tends to increase in England and Wales. 64% of households owned their homes. That's quite a big margin, isn't it? Page 80. In 2011, outright or with a mortgage, the remaining 31% were tenants. Renting from a private sector or social landlord. This was a substantial turnaround from a century earlier in 1918. 77% of households in England and Wales lived in rented accommodation, and 23% were owner-occupiers. 77% households were in rented accommodation, 23% were home occupiers. The number of people who own their home may be less to wish to do so, because many are waiting to buy when circumstances allow. Table 3.1 summarises results of a survey conducted in the United Kingdom in 2011 by the polling organisation YouGov, commissioned by the Council of Mortgage Lenders. A sample of 2,056 adults, 2,556 adults, were asked what type of tenure they have now and what type they expected to have in 2 years' time and in 10 years' time. For people in this sample, selected to be representative of the population as a whole, home ownership was preferable to any type of renting. This first row shows that of those in the sample who are already home occupiers, 92% expect to remain so in 2 years' time, and 91% in 10 years' time. The fourth row shows that of those who are living with relatives, including parents or friends, at the time of survey, 48% aspire to be owners occupiers within 2 years, and 78% within 10 years. Page 81. What does table 3.1 tell you about the aspirations of those who were renting accommodation privately at the time of the survey? Did most of these households aspire to move into the home ownership in 2 years or 10 years' time? The aspiration towards home ownership is equally clear among private tenants in the CML survey, especially in the long term. 47% to be homeowners in 2 years, and 76% in 10 years. Only 37% expected to still be renting privately in 2 years, and this proportion falls to 12% after 10 years. For social housing tenants in the survey, the expectation of moving to ownership is less strong. 48% is still expected to be renting social housing after 2 years, while 44% still expected to live in social housing even after 10 years. While this might mean that more than 40% of social housing tenants were happy with their present tenant type. It may also indicate that some were resigned to staying in rented accommodation because of their social and financial situation, regarding future ownership as unrealistic rather than undesirable. More than 1 in 3, 36%, would prefer to be owner-occupied in 2 years next time, and this proportion grows to 43% for the 10 years horizon. Unlike the INS data quoted earlier, which comes from a census survey of the whole population, the CML data comes from a sample of people, and so is subject to error. In substantial terms, error is the difference between the true value of a variable and the value obtained for observation or sampling. The CML survey was also conducted online, which may have made it harder to keep the sample representative. Since around 25% of UK's adults still have fast broadband connection at the time of Comp 214, it could also be argued that the CML, as an association of financial companies offering mortgage loans, had a commercial interest in demonstrating suppressed demand from home buyers. Though it used an independent firm, YouGov, to ensure the research was independent, despite these caveats, the survey provides evidence that most households prefer. Owner occupation to renting: overall 74% expected or aspired to own their home 2 years after the survey, around 2014. And 81% saw themselves as home owners within 10 years. There is evidence, at least in the UK, that most households prefer owning to renting their homes. Rates of owner occupations have risen in most higher income countries. However, the proportion of owner occupiers remain much lower in some countries, and some survey evidence may overstate the number who actually switch from renting to owning in future. Page 83. Motives for home buying. Anyone that's coming into the new year thinking about buying a home, got new aspirations, new heights, new gains, new goals, new gains. Motives from home buying. This section looks from an economic perspective at the possible social and economic motives for wanting to own a home. A social motive, ownership and social outcome. Revisited. One powerful reason why people might want to buy their home rather than rent it from someone else has already been suggested in Chapter 2. Homeowners tend to be better off, and there is evidence that these advantages are passed on to the children. The British longitudinal study by Lupton, which you could read in section 2.1 of the previous chapter, identified a number of disadvantages associated with living it even briefly. In socially rented housing compared with owner-occupied housing, these disadvantages persisted for 4 generations born between 1946 and 2000. Though they were worse for those born before 1970 for each generation, every measure we used. Those who had been in social housing in childhood passed far worse as adults. In the light of evidence such as this, tenants might be expected to seek an escape into own occupation to gain the advantages that seem to go with buying a house. However, while there is a strong association between own occupation and better social outcomes, it's difficult to establish direct causation running through the own occupation to social advantage, as you lead in chapter 2. That is because the association might occur for other reasons, and it is very hard for researchers to control for all these. Changing their housing status may not, on its own, relieve people's disadvantage. If the root cause of this lies somewhere else, establishing cause and effect relationships in the social world is always difficult. For example, it's likely that having more income and wealth enables people to buy their homes and also improves their social outcomes. Higher income wealth, home ownership, better social outcomes. Lower income wealth, rented homes, worse social outcomes. These arrows representing directional causation suggest that it is being economically better off that enables people to become owner occupiers and also leads to their being socially better off. This would make owner occupation an effect and not a cause of people's social disadvantage. So just moving families into owner occupation without raising their home and wealth might not improve their social situation. In addition, some research suggests that people, especially children, are disadvantaged with their household moves house frequently, and that those who rent tend to move frequently. Newman and Harkness, 2002, Dial Guest and McKenna, 2014, show the casual process could be home ownership, long stay at address, better social outcomes, rented home, frequent change of address, worse social outcomes. In this case, renting is not a fundamental cause of the disadvantage, which could be removed if the household could stay at one address. Social scientists can eliminate or control for all the possible source of different when seeking to explain contrasting outcomes. That is why, despite finding measurable differences in latter life outcomes for owners and renters, Lupton et al. Conclude we cannot be sure that these differences were caused by childhood experience of social housing. What might it be hard to find examples of housing that differ only in their housing tenant types and not in their income or wealth? Such a sample may be hard to find because of the strong tendency to switch from renting to owning. When the income rises, it may be difficult to find a large group of high-income families that still rent, or low families that are in own occupation. So, an example that contains households with identical income and wealth, which differ only by type of tenure. It is likely to be small and representative of the majority. It may be hard to draw statistically significant results from such a sample. Although the causes are not known from a certain, there is much research suggesting that over long periods of time, owner-occupiers enjoy better social outcomes than renters on average. Mulder and Smith. This is often one of the reasons why governments try to promote owner-occupation, however. Indirect cause of advantage, such as higher income, and undetected cause of disadvantage, such as frequent movement, may mean that just moving people from renting to owner occupation will not improve their situation. To achieve the benefits associated with home ownership, policymakers may have to promote other factors associated with it, such as higher income and longer stays in bigger houses at better side of town. 2.2. An economic motive, capital gain. It can be cheaper to buy a house or flat to rent an equivalent property, that is, the monthly housing cost for an owner. Mainly the mortgage repayments and the repair, maintenance and insurance costs incurred by owners are often lower than the monthly rent charge to tenants. The lower cost of the ownership may be promoted by governments, for example, by making low-cost mortgage loans available. If they believe that increased owner occupation leads to better social outcomes. So what look like individual preferences for buying a house rather than renting can be encouraged by official policies. Even if monthly cost of buying exceeds that the renting of the prospect of eventual full ownership. When the mortgage is paid off, they still make it an attractive option. People often see home buying as an investment, comparable to buying pension plans or a portfolio of shares. Some countries, including the UK, have experienced a growth in buy-to-let purchases, aimed explicitly at generating rent like other investments. A house produces a flow of income. For owner-occupiers, this is the money saved by not having to pay rent, a flow that economists call the implicit rent. Also, like other investments, a house can deliver a capital gain if, as often happens, it can be sold in the future for more than what it's bought for. The income and capital gain expressed as a percentage of the original investment give the rate of return on that investment, also called return on investment, or ROI. If the ROI over a given period is greater than the rise in price inflation, over that period the investment is said to have generated positive real return. Where house price inflation has been greater than general consumer or retail price inflation in a number of OECD countries, it means that house prices has risen in real terms. However, home ownership is often riskier than other investments that households might make. House prices can fall as well as rise, reflecting capital loss. If they fall a long way, the house can end up being worth less than the mortgage that was used to buy it, leaving households in negative equity, unable to repay their debt from the proceeds of selling the house. Properties is also an illiquid investment, that is, it is not necessarily converted into cash, especially when the economy is not growing. Also, a house is an diversified investment for many homeowners. It is their dominant or only asset. Most other investments can be diversified across a wide variety of company shares and other financial products, so little is lost if one of the components fails. Couple more pages go. Despite these risks, it is a widespread belief that property, real estate investment will hold its value, being effective store of wealth over time. One way to test the accuracy of the belief is to compare changes over time in house prices and in general level prices. This is done in figure 3.2, which plots an index of UK house prices alongside the consumer price index (CPI) between 1996 and 2014. The CPI is an official statistical measure used to measure the rise in prices of a basket of goods over a period of time. Does figure 3.2 confirm that house prices always rose faster than consumer prices in the UK from 1996 to 2014? In the discussion, figure 3.2 must read carefully because it is a graph of two different vertical scales. The blue line shows the annual percentage rise and falls in an index of house prices and most be read against the left-hand scale. This index varies considerably from year to year, for example, rising over 25% in 2003 and falling almost 20% in 2009. The red line shows annual percentage changes in the consumer price index (CPI) and must be read against the right-hand scale. This index shows less variation. The house price index used here comes from the Nationwide, the UK's largest building society, for most of this period, while the CPI is calculated by the Office of National Statistics (ONS). Comparison of two lines shows that the house prices rose much faster than consumer prices in the period 1996 to 2007. House prices then either fell or experienced growth consistently lower than consumer price growth from 2008 to 2013. Before house price inflation again moved above inflation in 2014, home buyers therefore enjoyed real inflation-adjusted increase in the price of average property for the first part of this period, but suffered a steep fall in real property values in the 5 years from 2008. Another way to make the comparison is to adjusting house prices for inflation and plotting the inflation-adjusted house prices over time. This is done in figure 3.3, which shows a price of a typical house of calculated by Nationwide, and after all has been adjusted downward to remove the effect of general price inflation. The blue line shows inflation adjusted price of typical house in each quarter from 1978 first quarter to 2014 the first quarter. This shows that there were sharp real increases of house prices from 1986 to 1989 and 1996 to 2004, but sharp falls between 1998, 1992, 2008 and 2009 and 2010 and 2013. The red line has been fitted to the quarterly price line to represent a long-term trend. This shows real house prices rising at the average annual rate of around 2.7% in the period of 1978 to 2014, but the trend conceals considerable quarter-on-quarter volatility, including some periods when house prices fell very sharply. 2.2.1 The importance of leverage for home buyer capital gains. Usually in contrast to business, people in households cannot borrow money to invest. Homeowners with 4% were buying their home with a mortgage, not a down payment, representing their initial equity in the house, and finance the rest of the price through a mortgage loan. As the equity is the amount they actually invest, then return on equity is a relevant return on their investment. An example, family A has managed to save 80,000 and borrows only the last 20,000. Family B managed to put down 20,000 and it is down payment, borrowing the other 80,000 for each as a debt to equity ratio. That is the amount borrowed divided by equity. It is 20,000, 80,000 to 1, whereas family B, this is higher leverage purchase. Both families which borrowed a relatively small amount. The capital gain is just 1/4 of the equity put in. The return on equity is 25%. For family B, which borrowed more heavily, the capital gain of 20% is equivalent to the equity, giving an ROE of 100%. When house prices rise, the proportional capital gains are much bigger for those who bought with less equity and more debt. Page 9. Yeah, we might possibly get to 120. We'll see how we go later on. But anyway, that's what I wanted to get to today. Page 60 to page 9. It's 30 pages.